The moral issue, what is right and wrong, there are moral issues. You decide. I became a vicious animal, and if you think that is so terrible, I just wish anyone could have been there in my place. So anyone who's going to pass judgment, fine. I was vicious. My intent was to kill him. And you just decide what's right and wrong.
In 1981, crime spiked in New York City. 2,166 people were murdered that year, which is a staggering amount if we compare it to the 289 murder victims in 2018. And the streets were flooded with drugs and gang violence. This is a trend that would continue up until the 90s, when the violence and robberies began due to tough-on-crime policing methods rapidly drop. A lot of people credited New York's previous mayor Rudy Giuliani for the decline, even though the decline in crime rate had actually begun before Giuliani had ever been handed the keys to the city. And Americans are to this day still split regarding their views of Giuliani. Some praise him as being the hero who cleaned up New York and restored order, albeit through drastic methods, while others view him as a corrupt opportunist who stole the credit for the hard work that was put into the city by his predecessors. Either way, what is certain is that the 1980s in New York City was not a fun time to be a person like Bernhard Goetz.
The shots tore into the soul of a city and a nation. The sudden gunfire sparked one of the most highly publicized, analyzed, and controversial criminal cases in America, challenging our concepts of crime, fear, and self-defense. It was a Saturday afternoon, December 22nd, 1984, 3 days before Christmas. Bernhard Goetz, a shy, divorced electronics engineer, left his apartment on Manhattan's 14th Street to meet some friends for holiday drinks. On a speeding downtown subway train, he met 4 teenagers who would change his destiny. In the rear of car number 7657, much like this one, the tall, lanky passenger was approached by at least one of the 4 black teenagers who asked for or demanded $5. Fearing he was about to be robbed and beaten, Goetz opened fire with an unlicensed .38 caliber handgun, loaded with hollow point bullets. Troy Canty, the most brazen of the 4, the one who confronted Goetz, took a bullet in the chest. Barry Allen was hit in the upper back. James Ramseur was shot in the left arm and chest. Darrell Cabey was the most seriously wounded of the 4. Goetz's bullet pierced his lower back, crossing his body, severing his spinal cord, paralyzing him instantly. After firing the fateful shots, Goetz ran from the subway car, heading down the tracks, exiting at the Chambers Street station. He disappeared into the fabric of the city, leaving in his wake a public furor. Hero or villain?
If it was me, I would have killed the guy. I mean, if it was me and I had to defend myself, I would have done exactly the same thing. And I think we've gotten to a point where it's not safe to be here. And we're all victims. And if we allow ourselves to be victimized, it's going to continue.
If he really thought that his life was in danger, then you have a right to protect yourself. However, if he did it on impulse, then he was wrong.
He overreacted a little, no question about it, but you have to realize that he was under tension. I mean, the man was minding his own business and somebody comes on him. I mean, it's hard to predict what anybody would do.
A human is going to be a human, no matter what you are, black or white. You're going to defend what's yours. And they was after him, so naturally, he's going to react first. Chances are, if he wouldn't have shot them, they would have did something to him first. I mean, it's self-preservation.
These people sound like Swedes, to be honest, right now. I've heard the same words daily, pretty much, that are full of distrust and full of fear. And here's what I want to focus on in this video, and it is also the reason to why I'm talking about Goetz. I want us to talk about how people like him are created. In 1981, Goetz was attacked in Lower Manhattan in broad daylight. He got robbed, badly beaten, and was left with permanent injuries and a seething hatred and bitterness against criminals and the poor handling of crime in New York City. And despite having had his application for a firearms permit rejected after the incident, he decided to anyway buy a gun illegally for his own protection. And I recognize a lot of this from living in Sweden. Not the part about illegally acquiring guns, we're not really there yet, but this complete distrust in an ineffective criminal justice system. Because it time and time again shows people that if something happens to you, you are on your own. And it's eerie how similar Goetz's arguments for his actions are to the way a lot of Swedes are thinking right now. When it comes to the rapes, the beatings, the stabbings, the constant bombings that are now reaching unprecedented levels and are now more common in Sweden than in any other country in Europe. Goetz also knew that he was alone, and he reasoned with that in mind. And I've begun to see that attitude in Swedes as well.
I got on the train. The reason I got on that car, I was going to get in another car. The reason I got in that car was relatively empty. There were plenty of seats available. Now, I didn't realize until 2 days after this happened why that car was relatively empty. These guys had emptied out the car. You know, people aren't that dumb in New York. When there are guys like this around, the car has a tendency to get empty, and the people are right. One of the fellows who was lying down, he said, there were 4 fellows in there. He lied down, and he was lying down, and he looked at me and he said, "How are you doing?" Now, legally, that's a nothing statement, and this is an everyday statement, and that meant nothing to me. But things started clicking in my mind. Now, I was the only person in that section of the car with those 4. They were all either in front of me or on my right-hand side.
Point is, how do you interpret how we are doing when
I interpreted that as nothing. That was just like, it wasn't even a warning signal. It was just because my response to that was, I was looking down. I know it's impolite to look at people sometimes, so I was looking down. I looked down and I said, "Fine."
Okay. Now, you interpret that then, what was your feeling when it said, "How are you doing"? What were you thinking at that time? What was your impression of how are you doing? What were you feeling?
These were just kids kidding around.
Okay.
That's all. Could have been just kids kidding around, but it's just a possible warning. Just a possible. It wasn't even a possible warning. I wasn't primed. But then 2 of them stood up. Okay. And they walked over to my left. Okay. Now there were 2 on my right and 2 on my left. The fellow on my right, one of them, at one time he had his hand in his pocket with this bulge thing. Now I'd seen that before, and I know it's bullshit. Okay, no, that was nothing. That was nothing. Well, no. What happens next? Saying, "How are you doing?" That's not a threat to me in my mind. The bulge in my pocket, in his pocket, that's not a threat to me.
Okay.
The situation when the 2 move on my left and the 2 are on my right, now that is a real fucking threat. And if you don't recognize that, okay, that is a real threat. And the one on my left, he asked me. He didn't ask what he used. According to the papers, he asked me. His exact words were, "Give me $5." He said it with a smile, and his eyes were bright. The words meant bullshit. I knew I had to pull the gun, but it was the look. Now, you cannot understand this. It was his eyes were shiny. He had a smile on his face. He claimed it was all a joke. If you believe that, I accept that. When I saw the smile on his face and the shine in his eyes, that he was enjoying this, I knew what they were going to do.
I recognize this. I've experienced similar behavior from thugs in Sweden. It's like they're fishing. They throw out bait to see if you're dumb enough to react. I remember one time when I was living in Malmö, I was walking with my wife and our dog down the street when this guy and his friend, who were walking on the other side of the street, shouted something at us and laughed. I stopped and asked him what he said. The guy immediately then began to walk towards me, but his friend stopped him and said, "No, let it go." So I started walking away as well. The guy then screams at me, "Yeah, keep walking, faggot." I had never met this person before in my life, and I wonder what he would have done if his handler hadn't been there to hold on to his leash. Whatever he shouted at us was bait. He wanted me to hear it and he wanted me to stop. He wanted me to give him any reason to fight me. And Goetz had experienced this kind of bullshit as well. He recognized bait when he heard it.
What did you think they were going to do?
How can you ask a question like that? They were going to have fun with me, miss.
What do you mean by that?
What do you mean?
What is your interpretation of that? I can't get inside your head.
Beat the shit out of you.
I know for people who are not sort of used to violence and conflict in these types of situations, it might seem stupid that he reacted the way he did to this question, but it really isn't. I've heard about cases where some punk asked the person what time it is, and when the person took up his cell phone to check, he got sucker punched. That shit happens for no reason, just because the attacker can, just for fun. When a group of idiots scream and laugh loudly inside a movie theater when the movie is playing, that is bait. That is them waiting for someone to react, to protest, to give them a reason to fight. I've seen this so many times in Sweden, and it's almost entirely coming from young people with an immigrant background. I struggle to even remember a single case where it has been ethnic Swedes who have been acting in this way. This phishing behavior is described in detail in national economist Tino Sanandaji's excellent book Massutmaning, roughly translated to Mass Challenge, in which he describes the economic but also social problems and obstacles which constitute the failure of Sweden's decades of mass immigration and failed integration. And an entire chapter is dedicated to antisocial behavior. The antisocial and confrontational behavior, primarily coming from young adults with an immigrant background, is rarely, if ever, properly addressed, and is even more rarely punished legally. This antisocial behavior consists of acts where they totally take over the entire space in a public place, either yelling, laughing loudly, breaking things, taking things straight off the shelves in stores, and just walking out, all in an effort to provoke a reaction and use violence in order to, as they claim, gain respect. Our public library is often located very locally and primarily staffed by librarians with little to no ability to remove disruptive people, have in some areas turned into places where young immigrant gangs hang out, disturb people, smoke, yell, and if confronted about their behavior, they react with violence. I've made an entire video with a perfect example of this antisocial behavior when it's taken to its extreme. A group of young men in Kortedala in Gothenburg kicked an old man half to death, leaving him with permanent and severe brain damage. They kicked in one of his eye sockets, blinding him on that eye, and jumped with both their feet on his skull and kicked his head. So what was his crime? What did he do that was deserving of this brutal behavior? He told them to stop harassing and throwing things at his dog that he had tied up outside of a convenience store when he'd gone in shopping. All of these sociopathic little shits were of course either freed entirely from any legal repercussions or got pathetic sentences of a couple of hours of community service. That is the punishment you get for leaving an old man blinded on one eye and with permanent brain damage for the rest of his life. The handling of this case, or perhaps I should say lack of handling, sounds very similar to what happened to Goetz.
Just being mugged, just going through the ordeal of getting beat up, very humiliating, especially for a guy like Bernhard Goetz, just kind of a skinny, a kind of a guy that, if you were a mugger, he'd be the perfect guy to bother because, what the hell's he gonna do? But then the other side of it was the police, the guys got caught, they went in, they got out of the precinct before he did. Now that's upsetting, to go through that. These guys walk off and you're still there trying to get something done, and nothing ever came out of it.
This right here is Sweden today. This shit is the Swedish justice system for you. I recognize completely what they're talking about here. That's the part about this that is so fucked up. New York, during its most crime-ridden and violent days, had in the background the same dysfunctional criminal justice system that we today have in Sweden. I'm not saying Sweden is as bad as New York, of course not, but the description of the problems sounds really similar. Weak punishments, low rates of incarceration, and I'm not alone in thinking this. Every day I hear about cases where scum are let out with a slap on the wrist. I've even read about cops wondering why the hell they're even doing their job anymore. They bring in drug dealers, people caught carrying illegal firearms, what have you, but they then are let right back out on the streets. And sometimes they even get generously paid for the suffering of having to stay 1 hour too long in jail without having been charged. So we don't just bring them in and let them out immediately, we also pay criminals for the trouble of doing so.
Now that's upsetting.
Bernhard Goetz not only fundamentally changed America's view on criminal justice and self-defense, he also provided a unique insight into the specific situation which causes a law-abiding electrical engineer, vegetarian and animal lover with no previous criminal record to get an unlicensed firearm and gun down 4 people. That transformation of a person is symptomatic of a greater problem. Because I don't think Goetz was crazy. I think he was very, very afraid and simply refused to become a victim again. And that can happen to anyone. And if nothing happens with the Swedish criminal justice system, where scum keeps getting let back out on the streets, our cities keep getting bombed, and foreigners who rape and torture Swedes, who are even here illegally, are still allowed to stay in the country, if that keeps going on, we're well on our way of creating our own future Bernhard Goetz. If the bombings and shootings in broad daylight continue, someone will eventually have enough. Someone will become scared enough that they will do something like that. It's just a matter of time at this point, if nothing happens. In Sweden, we have the fastest growing number of hand grenade attacks in all of Europe, and as late as in 2016, grenades were still not legally considered to be weapons. Our criminal justice system is desperately trying to catch up with the increasing levels of violence and antisocial behavior, primarily affecting immigrants in our inner city suburbs, and in a lot of these areas, people have stopped reporting these crimes altogether because the police usually can't handle all of the incidents, and people don't want to be branded as a snitch. And then idiots at our biggest newspapers have the gall to be cheering about how reported crime is going down and Sweden is safer than ever. It's going down because the victims of this crime have given up. There exist several cases in Sweden where witnesses have been murdered in their own homes by armed criminals, so I wouldn't be that eager to speak up either. That doesn't mean that crime is going down. Anyway, despite this chanting about an alleged decrease in crime, the bombings keep spreading into more central areas of our cities, and previously there existed this very primitive form of code of honor where criminal gangs didn't set off grenades in areas where large amounts of people were, but that is gone. Anyone in the wrong place at the wrong time can today get blown up by a grenade that, according to the Swedish police, cost less than €2 on the black market. In the end, I don't support the actions of Bernhard Goetz, but I don't blame him for acting the way he did either. I would probably have done the same. Because if the state can no longer ensure the safety of its citizens, no one is in a position, really, where they are free to pass judgment.
If you take a rat and you corner it, and you, let's say just one time, you start poking it with red hot needles, and the rat doesn't know how to react, and you do this, okay, and you wind up doing it again, or perhaps again, and if once in a while a rat turns viciously on you and just becomes a total vicious killer, which is really what I was, then don't go passing statements of morality saying, well, this was not warranted, or this was, you should have done this, or all you had to do was show the gun. I've been in situations where I've shown the gun. What happened here is I snapped.